Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Laura Dormer from the Evidence Base, and today we're going to be talking about the growing role of real-world evidence in the evaluation and regulation of medical devices. Now, as regulators are increasingly looking beyond traditional clinical investigations, real-world data is becoming an important part of how device safety, performance and value are assessed across the product lifecycle. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by Ariann Stone and Myla Maloney from Premier Applied Sciences, who are going to share their perspective with us on how RWE is being used in practice, some recent regulatory developments, and what this could mean for medical device companies going forward. So to start things off, if you could introduce yourselves and your roles at Premier, and briefly describe how the work of Premier Applied Sciences relates to RWD and RWE generation for the medical devices. Myla, if you want to go first.
Absolutely. Hello, I am Myla Maloney. I'm the Chief Growth Officer for Premier Applied Sciences. And just to talk for a minute about Premier and who we are in Premier Applied Sciences, Premier represents 4,350 hospitals and health systems, as well as over 300,000 non-acute providers. And we leverage our relationships to do a variety of things, including generating evidence and bringing in data. That's the area that's most relevant to what we'll be talking about today. We're going to talk later a lot more about what that means, but at a high level, because we have these relationships with health systems, we're able to leverage them with life sciences to do really meaningful work to impact patients and bring innovations to market.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ariann Stone. My role is the Vice President of Business Development and Strategic Relationships. And what that really means is I serve in the cross-section of data, strategy, and partnerships, which is a really exciting space to be in. My day-to-day work encompasses things like data sourcing, whether that's through the organic data that we have natively within Premier, working with ad hoc linkages where we're bringing together different data sets, as well as with business-to-business partnerships with other real-world data vendors.
Now, from your perspectives, what are the key advantages of using RWE for medical devices across the product lifecycle, so including pre- and post-market settings?
Well, and obviously RCTs are important. However, you are limiting a patient population when you do that for what's appropriate for a study. And while that gives you important data to come to market, it doesn't allow for the same level of innovation because there might be things you want to study, but there might be things you didn't realize you should study that you can uncover when you don't limit it. It's just actually what's happening. It's also really good for providers. It gives them better guidance on things they might already be doing, but it helps them see what are others doing because now it can be put into a label and you can provide guidance. It also may encourage payer coverage. When you think about a medical device, that can be really important to a healthcare system because they may absorb the cost for anything a payer doesn't cover. It could fall under a DRG, for instance, and then they have to consider trade-offs for which innovations they want. It's also good for patients. It gives more guidance around what those appropriate patients are. Maybe patients who couldn't have accessed it because the study didn't include them, you now can see that it should. That payer coverage also becomes important to patients. Maybe something they couldn't have afforded, they now can because payers with the right guidance and parameters are more comfortable to cover something. So really across the healthcare ecosystem, it has benefit. And we're already seeing that as more and more labels are being updated using real-world evidence.
How can data from sources such as the Premier Healthcare Database be used to support regulatory needs and submissions for medical devices, both before and after market entry?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And let's ground a little bit on what the Premier Healthcare Database is, and then let's talk a little bit about what's important when you're looking at real-world data sources for your regulatory study. So the Premier Healthcare Database is a de-identified asset with about 1,400 hospitals. We actually source that data directly from the provider organizations. It is both geographically and demographically representative of the nation, and you can see about 1 in every 4 patients in the US in the data set. The data itself is super rich. So there's administrative data like facility and patient demographics. There is service level data. So think about things like your CPT codes and your ICD codes and your HCPCS codes. And there's also financial and billing data. So it's a really rich resource for this type of evidence generation for regulatory purposes. But one of the key differentiators that you'll find in the data set is the ability to see specific product names. And so when you think about a medical device company and the use of real world data for these regulatory submission purposes, being able to see your specific device in the data set and the clinical information surrounding the use of that device is going to be extremely important. So data sets that have that attribute are increasingly valuable for these purposes. So I do want to talk a little bit about some key things to consider when you're selecting a real world data source for your particular real world evidence generation project. And it's important to think about the regulatory use and the clinical context. So ensuring that the data you're using and your study methods are going to align with your purpose. So ask yourself things like, is the data set relevant to your study population? And does it have the right variables and covariates to support your endpoints? And is there appropriate data provenance? These are all things that are going to be important as you evaluate your data set and put forward your package for submission. We've actually had our data set evaluated against these factors, and I'm going to ask Myla to tell you a little bit more about that.
I mean, there was nobody more excited than us when the 21st Century Cures Act came out because of everything Ariann just shared about the Premier Healthcare Database. We're like, yes, we think we're going to be the right data set, but that was our internal opinion. So we actually hired an external company to do an analysis against the things that Ariann shared, as well as other considerations as well. And conclusively and almost easily, they came back and said, yes, in general, your data set, maybe sometimes by itself, maybe tokenized with other data sets, maybe with augmented with some chart reviews, should be able to meet it. Now, of course, each study needs its own evaluation. Just because you can say that in general doesn't mean that when you start to look at a specific patient population that you won't find yes or no for that. But it was very encouraging when we heard that. We no longer have to live in the world of theory because, and we'll talk about some examples in a bit, but we actually have seen success with our data, with us doing submissions as well as device manufacturers licensing our data and using it in and outside of the US for regulatory submissions. So we know it to be true. We know the FDA, the EU MDR, China, and others have accepted this data. And so it did line up with that external point of view that we got. I would also like to share the types of scenarios that are best when using data sets like ours. So if you think about things like off-label use, so a manufacturer may never recommend something off-label, but a doctor is going to do what's best for their patient, as they should. When that happens at volumes that are high enough, we see it in our data. That is an ideal use case to evaluate against our data. It could be used for efficacy. It also can be used for safety. So we've seen true label expansions for efficacy, but we've also seen when a medical device was given a black box warning as a class effect, and they were able to use our data to determine that same safety concern did not exist with use of their product and actually get that black box warning removed. This is great. Now we don't have to use generalizable type data across all med devices. They can really differentiate based on what the evidence shows for what they can and cannot do.
Premier has been involved in collaborations with industry organizations to advance the use of RWE for medical device evaluation. Can you talk us through these partnerships and how they help?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. About a year ago, we announced a notable collaboration with an organization called the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST for short. And what's really important about this collaboration is that both organizations are aligned to advance the use of real-world data in medical device evaluation and for evidence generation purposes. What we were so proud of and remain proud of in this collaboration is that our data is actually being assessed towards what NEST calls their NEST Mark approach. And this is an approach that's actually going to structure the assessment and the use of that real-world data for those regulatory submissions. So ultimately, the goal here is that this is going to help confidence levels rise in the use of real world data for RWE generation and for regulatory submissions. And it's going to help promote the use of this method more widely in the industry.
Are you able to share an example where real-world data has supported regulatory decision-making for a medical device, and what insights did the data enable, and what made that approach effective?
Well, in the spirit of being overachievers, we're going to share two. In the first one, I will not be able to tell you the name of the company, but in the second, I actually can. It's in the public domain. So in the first one, this organization had a device that they anticipated based on earlier evidence that it could have benefit for patients beyond where it was currently indicated, and they wanted to test that out. They decided to use real world evidence to do that. Could they find the right appropriate level of efficacy, and could they determine the safety for those patients? They used our data to do this, and then they had a successful submission with the FDA. They went ahead and calculated time and cost and the change. They estimate that they saved $3 million in over a year and a half by doing it in this way. That sounds great for them, but it's not just great for them. It's also great for patients because those costs have to be recouped. You can't stay in business by having things cost you money to do. You have to, in turn, have a return on investment. Well, if you save $3 million in 18 months, that's a lot of money and time that you then don't have to try to recoup back in the marketplace. But it's also great because these patients who would not have benefited from it until they could get the RCT done, if they decided to go forward, now can go ahead and get that product. So that was a really exciting one. The second one is a recent press release, and this was something that was done by Teleflex. So they're very comfortable having us name this. And they had a high-risk device where they really needed to assess a variety of outcomes that would have been hard to do in an RCT. You actually needed it in the marketplace because it also included traceability. So this is data they weren't sure they could even have done without real world evidence. And I think that's something we haven't even talked about. We've been saying real world evidence instead of an RCT. Sometimes it's real world evidence instead of nothing. And what a loss that is from an innovation and patient benefit standpoint if you can't do that. I think what's also interesting is look how few companies are willing to share their names and what they're doing because it's so proprietary. And one of the things that does is it makes it difficult for other companies to learn from each other and have more of these submissions because it's hard information to be comfortable to share out into the market.
What are some examples of industry advancements supporting the use of real-world data and real-world evidence in regulatory submissions?
I'll start with just being willing to do it. That's a huge leap. I come from a pharmaceutical company, and I can tell you that it is hard to get this kind of change when you're used to doing something in one particular way. But what we are starting to see with some of the medical device companies and pharmaceutical companies, I would say, is that they're having positions and sometimes entire teams that are devoted solely to generating real world evidence and leveraging it for regulatory submissions. And that's really exciting. I also have started to notice a trend where they're going for bolder submissions. So at first you'd see them dipping their toe in the water. They might just do the analysis internally to see what would have happened, not yet submit it to the FDA, not do any flagging that they might do it, but just see what would happen. When enough of those have been coming back positive, they've been trying something small. What if we just add a population or add something small? Then those started coming back more successfully. And now you're seeing entire indications and you're seeing the integration of real world evidence into clinical trials. So it's not even just an either or, you're seeing that hybrid approach and then even more sharing amongst peers. So what used to be just a theoretical topic at a teleconference that everybody would, or a conference that everybody would run into and want to attend, now you're seeing people come with real examples, blinded and unblinded, that they're sharing out into the community.
And finally, looking ahead, how do you see the role of real-world data and real-world evidence in medical device regulation evolving over the next few years, and what is most needed to support broader adoption?
Yeah, I really love this question because it challenges us to think about the future. What I would hope becomes the future state in very short order is that the use of real world data to generate the evidence necessary for regulatory submissions just becomes standard, right? Something that all organizations are accustomed to and incorporating into their operations for the many benefits that we've discussed today. But I think in order to get there, companies need the type of guidance that has been coming out from regulators and from other organizations like NEST, so that they can become more comfortable, right? I think that they need to really understand the process, buy into the process, and all of those types of efforts help build trust and repeatability. So I think really that time is the answer. I'll echo one of the comments that Myla made earlier, which is being able to talk publicly about your successes or your learnings and sharing that information. I think that also helps build community and build shared practices that we can all lean into.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, Ariann, and thank you, Myla, for sharing your insights on this topic. It's encouraging to see the progress that's being made in the use of real-world evidence of medical devices, and looking forward to seeing how this continues to evolve. So thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.